EDU4EPP Assessment Task 1A Analysis on the case of Jack Daniel Johnson. Analysis of the facts of the case. For this assignment, we will be critically analysing the case involving Jack Daniel Johnson, whose serious misconduct resulted in a formal hearing initiated by the Victorian Institute of Teaching. In the case of Johnson v. the Victorian Institute of Teaching, a hearing occurred into his professional conduct after his employer, being the school at which he had been employed with, had informed the institute that as a school community they had launched an internal investigation in relation to the alleged serious misconduct of the teacher. For the period of slightly over a month, it is alleged that the then Duke of Edinburgh Programme Coordinator had formed an inappropriate relationship with one of his students whilst registered as a teacher. In the formal hearing, it was revealed that Johnson's behaviour and actions were not considered to be of a professional nature and incongruent with the requirements of a VIT and its internal code of ethics and code of conduct. In the particulars of the case, it was revealed that Johnson had deviated from his professional standing as a teacher by developing an inappropriate relationship with a student by communicating through social media platforms such as Snapchat and Facebook, sending unsolicited and inappropriate messages and emails to the student in question, which departs from the Institute's professional code of conduct. This included an image of Johnson wearing a towel which only covered him from the waist down, repeatedly asking the student to send him images, indicating to the student that their communications and relationship should be kept intimate and confidential, using provocative references to her by suggesting that she was a spunk, which could be interpreted in a sexual manner, and repeatedly asking for the student to meet up with him, whether it be on or off the school's premises. Mullane labels this kind of behaviour as an inappropriate relationship, as it has the potential to jeopardise a teacher's employment and could lead to cancellation or suspension of a teacher's registration. The facts revealed by counsel demonstrate that Johnson had deviated from the profession's standards of conduct and practice, in addition to bring the teaching profession into disrepute. By engaging in such a manner, the educator had breached his professional obligations that are stipulated by the VIT's Code of Conduct, specifically Principles 1.4 and 1.5. These two principles demand that all educators maintain a level of objectivity with all students, whilst also maintaining a professional relationship with all students, whether it be in a school setting or not.
Legal implications. The fact that Johnson had formed an inappropriate relationship with a student by communicating with her on social media, he had granted the panel grounds for action against him. The Department of Education and Training highlights misconduct and other grounds for action under Division 10 of the Education and Training Reform Act 2006 can include inappropriate relationships with students and include conduct outside as well as inside the workplace, which in this case was social media. The Education and Training Reform Act 2006 underlines in sections 2.6.3 that the Victorian Institute of Teaching, VIT, has to develop, maintain, and promote a code of conduct for the teaching profession. The VIT Code of Conduct specifies in Principle 1.4 that teachers maintain objectivity in their relationship with students, and Principle 1.5 outlines that teachers are always in a professional relationship with their learners, whether at the education setting where they teach or not. Johnson was not professional in his engagement and failed to sustain detachment from his students. Thus, he had breached both principles. The VIT can deem Johnson failing to comply with the Code of Conduct reason for a charge of serious misconduct. Since Johnson is over the age of 18 years and is communicating by words and conduct, sending photographs with another person who is a child under the age of 16 years, Johnson could be found guilty of grooming for sexual conduct with a child under the age of 16 under the Crimes Act 1958, Section 49, if the student was under the age of 16. This offense could see him being liable of level 5 imprisonment with a maximum of 10 years in jail. However, to be charged with this offense, Johnson must intend the communication facilitates the student engaging or being involved in the commission of a sexual offense with himself. The formal hearing may not have generated enough substantial evidence that Johnson had an intent to commit a sexual offense. Johnson had argued he was not attempting to push the boundaries of his relationship with the student even further. However, his communication with the student suggested otherwise. The evidence claimed that Johnson had hoped to meet the student alone on multiple occasions, including whilst in school, camp, and at her home. He had sent inappropriate messages and emails, requested the student to send him photographs, and be cheeky with him. If Johnson is found to be guilty of grooming, this would classify as a Category A offense. The Education and Training Reform Act, 2006, Section 1.1.3 defines a Category A offense as using a carriage service to transmit indecent communication to a person under 16 years of age. Therefore, in accordance with the Education and Training Reform Act, 2006, Section 2.3.10(1), the school must terminate the employment of Johnson if he was convicted or found guilty of this offense. The evidence states that Johnson's actions created an unsafe environment for the student and therefore caused the student to feel unsafe at school. According to the law in 2014, the student may sue for damages for the emotional and psychological injury suffered as a consequence of the relationship. Page 41. Since the child safe standards are mandatory for schools rather than the teachers, the school may be found to be in breach of the law of torts, as they were negligent and failed to observe a reasonable standard of care for the students. Standard 4 of the Child Safe Standards states that the school should provide screening, supervision, training, and other human resource practices that reduce the risk of child abuse. Johnson had stated that he did not recall ever receiving any formal training in what was appropriate behavior, either in his teacher education or as a teacher in the school in regard to social media and students. Johnson even stated that the school encouraged him to keep in touch with students using social media. If these claims were found to be true, it could suggest that the school failed in their duty of care. The panel found Johnson had engaged in serious misconduct and therefore concluded that a suspension from duty for a period of 18 months was appropriate, and conditions were placed on his registration, which included further training. However, I believe that Johnson's registration should have been cancelled, as his character is such that it is not in the best interest of the public to allow him to teach and this is in line with the Education and Training Reform Act 2006, Section 2.6.9.
The moral implication of the case study. Johnson's actions throughout this incident demonstrate the significant blurred and lack of moral values Johnson possesses. Morals can be described as the standard of behavior and the communal expectation of an individual, and thus there is a large amount of informal and informal types of morality within this case study that has been breached. The formal approach to morals can include the VIT Code of Conduct and the Australian Professional Standards of Teaching. The breach of informal morality can include the main areas of leadership and trust. Throughout the act of developing an inappropriate relationship with the student by communicating through social media platforms such as Snapchat and Facebook, Johnson's relationship with the student had become extremely unprofessional and thus led on the chain of disappointing and disturbing actions. Principle 1.4d of the VIT Code of Conduct demonstrates that Johnson did not maintain objectivity within the teacher-student relationship. Johnson has also failed 1.4c of the VIT Conduct, drawing learners into personal agendas through the act of communicating outside of education setting and or platform. After-hour contact via non-educational based platforms is deemed as concerning, wrong, deceitful to both that particular student and, in the eyes of the public, very morally implicating. The act of sending and requesting for photographs is significantly disturbing from a moral perspective. The action of sending photographs has breached the principle 1.4b of the VIT using sexual innuendo and materials with learners, and 1.5d holding conversation of a personal nature without valid context. Morally, Johnson's sense of honesty has been distorted. Johnson has failed to be honest to the profession of teaching and all of its codes. The inconsiderate, inappropriate, and unmoral use of ICT demonstrates a severe lack of leadership and teaching capability. Not only has Johnson severely breached the VIT Professional Code of Conduct, Johnson has also succeeded and also breaching the Australian Professional Standards of Teaching, specifically 4.5, using ICT safely, responsibly, and ethically. Johnson has failed to be a role model to his students as he hypocritically used ICT and his position of power to gain personal benefit. From an informal moral perspective, Johnson has failed to follow the communal expectations of safe ICT and teaching behaviour, and thus failed not only his students, colleagues, and caregivers, but he has also failed the teaching profession. Johnson has a moral obligation to follow the VIT Code of Conduct. All of Johnson's decisions and actions should have only the student's best interest at heart. Thus, the facts of the case can only reiterate how morally wrong Johnson is. A very clear breach of Principle 2.1 of the Code of Conduct has occurred, as Johnson exploited his position for an inappropriate and personal gain. This is demonstrated through the acts of secrecy that has occurred within the case study. Some examples are attempting to keep messages unknown, attempting to sneak out of school camp, and invitations to leave the class to pursue sexual intentions. With regards to the Australian Professional Standards for Teaching, through these acts of secrecy, Johnson has created an unsafe environment for all of his students, and thus failing Standard 4.4. These disturbing breaches only highlights the broken and corrupt sense of Johnson's moral compass. The Australian professional standards have been breached, and 4.4, maintaining student safety, has disturbingly been breached. All of Johnson's
It is difficult to cover the whole concept of ethics as by nature it varies from person to person. Formally, we have the VIT Code of Ethics, which attempts to give guidance on how we represent the values of integrity, respect, and responsibility which underpin the teaching profession. More informally, each person has their own unconscious biases, habits, and unthinking values which regulate our decision making. The allegations against Johnson violate what is the formal VIT Code of Ethics as well as the informal general standard that the public would hold. The ethics and morals of this case are inextricably linked to one another, as ethical behaviour encompasses a range of values relating to morality that is considered to be the right thing to do. Sending explicit photos and conversely asking for ones to be sent back violates everything related to the VIT Code of Ethics relating to student-teacher interactions. Moreover, from an informal perspective, how Johnson has behaved is so blatantly wrong that it is unfortunate that necessary moral and legal frameworks are in place to prevent and protect students from this type of thing. On a personal level, Johnson knows what he is doing is wrong. It is evident in the manner with which he pursues this particular student, suggesting cheeky nature, sneaking away from class and campgrounds together, as well as implying he would come over to her house if no one were home. These appear relatively innocuous in nature when compared to him specifically stating in messages to, quote, keep it secret and they need to make sure nobody really knows what's going on here. Statements such as these reflect a guilty conscience, one that knows they are doing the wrong thing ethically. All the more baffling is Johnson's instance where he is insistent that he had never received any formal training in ethics, to which counsel asked whether any member of the general public would require formal training regarding that type of behaviour, illustrating those informal codes of ethics that we all carry. Multiple times throughout the case file, Johnson attempts to justify his actions by stating a disconnection between himself and his colleagues, elaborating on how his personal relationship caused low self-esteem, and this was a way of boosting it. These are actions and excuses of a man who has not properly reflected on his actions and doesn't appear apologetic for doing them, but a man who wishes he wasn't caught. It is suggested that ethical teaching involves teachers thinking deeply about their actions, knowing the consequences of those decisions on students and their families, considerations which Johnson has clearly not taken into account when engaging with this particular student. Additionally, when confronted with his consequences, namely an 18-month suspension of his teaching registration, he attempts to have it shortened to 12 months, stating that he has already stepped away from teaching for 6 months. Rightfully so, the panel refused, stating that it served as a personal deterrent to Johnson, but also others in the profession. I personally believe that the panel's decision to only suspend him for 18 months, based on the idea that he's relatively early in his teaching career and still had time to develop appropriate understandings and values, is too small a sanction. Despite what the panel states, I believe that had the student not shown more maturity and divulged the situation to her parents, it could have continued down a very ugly path, and that he should have had his license cancelled.
Discussion of compliance measures. The Education and Training Reform Act 2006 provides the Victorian Institute of Teaching the power to enforce reasonable standards for all individuals registered with the institution, whilst also possessing the power to cancel, suspend, or impose conditions to a teacher's registration where deemed necessary. Moreover, it is a requirement of all teachers to abide by the Institute's Code of Conduct and Code of Ethics in order to uphold the Institute's high level of integrity and to safeguard the teaching profession. Specifically, the VIT Code of Conduct aims to provide registered individuals with a set of principles to guide teachers in their professional and personal conduct and assist them with ethical dilemmas. On the other hand, the Institute's Code of Ethics aims to instill integrity, respect, and responsibility in all of its teachers. In reviewing this case and its particulars, it is quite clear that Johnson had violated his responsibilities as a teacher and thus breached the Institute's Code of Conduct and Code of Ethics. Section 1 of the Code of Conduct is based on the notion of professional conduct and features 8 principles that all registered teachers should comply with. Through his actions, Johnson had breached Principles 1.4 and 1.5 of the Code. Principle 1.4 of the Code asserts that teachers maintain objectivity in their relationships with learners. This therefore means that the teacher should act professionally and not act like a friend or parent. Furthermore, Principle 1.5 of the Code maintains that teachers are always in a professional relationship with their learners, whether at the education setting where they teach or not. Considering the facts of this case, Johnson had also disregarded his compliance with these principles as he failed to preserve a professional relationship by using sexual innuendo with his student through sending unsolicited photos which were of a sexual nature, making sexual references to the student, sending messages of a personal nature with the student through the use of social media, and suggesting that he and the student meet outside of school hours, possibly at the student's home. Likewise, Johnson's actions and behaviour also compromise not only his school community, but the teaching profession as a whole. The actions exhibited by the teacher in question diminished the profession's value of integrity, as he did not engage and behave in a way that respects and advances the profession, whilst also removing himself from maintaining a professional relationship with his learners. Lastly, Johnson's behaviour had damaged the school's reputation by weakening parents' confidence in the school and bringing untoward attention to the school community. The sanctions given to Johnson not only served to improve his own teaching practice, but also the teaching profession as a whole. Although Johnson was directly implicated by the sanctions given, which was an 18-month suspension, it is hoped that such a penalty will make other educators in the profession from even considering in engaging in such behaviour. Consequently, such a penalty fulfills 4 out of the 5 purposes of sanctions, as Johnson was punished for his actions by being suspended and potentially rehabilitated through completing a personal development program. Moreover, the actions carried out by the VIT publicly denunciates this kind of serious misconduct, whilst also serving as a deterrent to other educators in the profession. Evaluation of sanctions given in the case. After discussing and investigating the case of Jack Johnson, as a professional learning team, we believe that the sanctions given to the teacher are not adequate enough given the facts of the case and the potential for Johnson's actions to have further escalated. By reviewing the case using legal, moral, and ethical frameworks, members of the PLT were all in agreement in that the sanctions handed down to Johnson were insufficient due to the seriousness and severity of his actions. Given that the case was treated in relation to serious misconduct, we believe that the teacher in question overstepped his professional boundaries and lost all levels of integrity and respect due to his actions and conduct. In doing so, Johnson also diminished the community's confidence in his professional conduct, which leaves an unwanted blemish on his reputation. Overall, we believe that Johnson's 18-month suspension was manifestly inadequate, and the cancellation of his teaching registration should have been applied in order to denunciate this kind of behaviour and deter other members of the profession from even thinking of engaging in such conduct.